The massive apex predator lowered its head towards the human, bearing razor-sharp fangs dripping with venom as its claws dug into the blood-red soil, muscles coiled to pounce and tear the intruder limb from limb. But rather than fleeing in terror like any sane creature would, the lone human simply reached out a steady hand to pet the murderous beast. Philip Brown knew his only chance of surviving this encounter deep in Dreadclaw territory was to rely on his knowledge of animal behavior to calm the snarling creature before him. Even the technologically advanced Milan, the reptilian inhabitants of planet Zorath, dared not set foot here, for the Dreadclaws were known to slaughter any and all intruders with ruthless efficiency. Philip had come to this dangerous alien world as an explorer and biologist, eager to study the unique life forms that called the harsh, unforgiving planet home. But the Milan viewed his arrival with deep suspicion and barely concealed fear. No human had ever set foot on Zorath before. The Milan leader, Ren, had reluctantly allowed Philip to stay, but not without strict conditions. He was to be accompanied at all times by a contingent of Milan warriors, both for his own protection and to ensure the human didn't cause any trouble. And above all else, Philip was warned to stay far away from Dreadclaw territory. To venture there was certain death. But Philip's fascination with Zorath's creatures drew him deeper into the untamed wilderness, until he crossed the invisible border into the Dreadclaw's domain. His Milan escorts immediately fled in panic, leaving the human alone and utterly defenseless before the monster emerging from the shadows. One wrong move would mean an instant and brutal demise. Philip's only hope was to keep the creature calm until he could slowly back away to safety. So he reached out, gently petting the Dreadclaw's snout, speaking to it in a soothing voice, praying his gambit would work. To the utter astonishment of the Milan warriors watching from a distance, ready to report back to Ren about the foolish human's gruesome death, the Dreadclaw didn't attack. It sniffed at Philip's hand, cocking its head curiously. Then, as the human continued to pet it and murmur calming words, the beast made a deep rumbling noise, almost like a purr, and rubbed its massive head against him affectionately. Word of the human who had tamed a Dreadclaw spread like wildfire through the Malin settlements. Most were shocked and unnerved, realizing these humans were far more formidable than they had ever imagined. Many called for Philip to be locked up or executed before he and his abilities brought untold calamity to their world. Tensions between the human biologist and his reluctant Milan hosts grew rapidly. But a small faction saw Philip in a different light, as a potential ally against the Dreadclaws and other dangers of their wild planet. For the first time, someone had found a way to turn Zorath's most fearsome predator from a threat into a tamed companion. As hostilities reach a boiling point, Philip finds himself trapped between the machinations of rival Milan factions. With his Dreadclaw companion at his side, he must use every ounce of wit, skill, and knowledge to navigate the treacherous political landscape and survive the untamed wilds of this deadly planet. The balance of power on Zorath is about to shift in unpredictable ways, with a single human at the center of the storm. Word of Philip's miraculous taming of the Dreadclaw spread through the Milan settlements like a wildfire in a drought. Soon, he found himself standing before Ren and the Milan leadership in their grand council chamber, the walls adorned with intricate carvings depicting the history of their people. The air crackled with tension as Ren leaned forward, his reptilian eyes narrowing. "You will tell us how you pacified the beast, every detail, now." Philip took a deep breath, meeting Ren's gaze. "I used my knowledge of animal behavior. I kept my body language non-threatening. I didn't make direct eye contact. Impossible!" sneered one of the advisors, slamming his clawed fist on the table. "No one has ever tamed a Dreadclaw. You must have used some trickery, some technology from your human world." Philip shook his head. "I didn't, But the Milan were not listening. They spoke over him, their voices rising in argument. "This human's knowledge could be valuable," said one. "If he can control the Dreadclaws, think of how many lives we could save." "Or how many he could take," countered another. "He threatens our very way of life. We cannot allow an outsider to wield such power." Ren raised a hand, silencing the debate. He fixed Philip with a calculating stare. We will put you to the test, human. Prove your worth, and you may stay on Zorath. Fail, and the consequences will be dire. The next day, flanked by a dozen Malon warriors, Philip found himself approaching a remote village on the edge of Dreadclaw territory. The villagers peered out from behind barricaded doors and shuttered windows, their faces etched with fear. The beasts have been attacking for weeks, explained the village elder, his voice trembling. They've taken our livestock, our crops. We cannot go on like this. Philip nodded, his expression grim. I'll see what I can do. As he tracked the Dreadclaws through the dense undergrowth, Philip noticed something strange. Broken branches, claw marks on trees. These were more than just the signs of a hunting pack. He knelt down, examining a set of tracks. They were too deliberate, too organized. A cold realization washed over him. The Dreadclaws weren't just acting on animal instinct. They were using tools, planning their attacks. They were far more intelligent than the Milan had ever realized. And then it hit him. The attacks on the village, the stolen prey, the Dreadclaws weren't acting out of aggression. They were responding to the Malan's expansion into their territory. Philip knew what he had to do. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the Dreadclaw pack. They turned to face him, fangs bared, but Philip held his ground. He began to mimic their vocalizations, using the scent markers he had collected to communicate his intentions. The Malon watched in stunned silence as Philip walked among the deadly predators, guiding them away from the village and back to their hunting grounds. It was a tense journey, but Philip's bond with the creatures held strong. Finally, they reached the Dreadclaw's territory. Philip set up a series of barriers using sense and visual markers to define the boundary. He hoped it would be enough to keep the peace. The villagers cheered as Philip returned, hailing him as their savior. But as he looked to the Malon leadership, he saw only suspicion and fear in their eyes. He had proven his abilities, but at what cost? What Philip didn't know was that Ren was already plotting against him in the shadows. As the humans' influence grew, so did the Malan's unease. The whispers began to spread. Some saw Philip as a hero, others as a threat to be eliminated. And caught in the middle of it all was Philip, unaware of the dangerous game of politics and power he had just stepped into. The future of Zorath hung in the balance, and he would soon find himself at the center of a conflict that could change everything. Philip's triumph over the Dreadclaw threat didn't bring him the respect he hoped for. Instead, whispers spread through the Malon settlements like poison. "Did you hear? The human controls those beasts," a merchant hissed to his customer. "He's the one behind the attacks." Similar conversations echoed across Zorath. Ren's loyalists worked tirelessly, planting seeds of doubt and fear. One evening, as Philip prepared for another expedition, a group of Malan ambushed him. They struck swiftly, overwhelming him with sheer numbers and advanced weaponry. Philip found himself bound and dragged before a hastily assembled tribunal. The makeshift courtroom buzzed with tension. Ren sat at the center, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed triumph. "Philip Brown, you stand accused of crimes against the Malon people," he declared. Philip's protests fell on deaf ears as witness after witness took the stand, recounting fabricated tales of his supposed treachery. He watched in horror as even those he considered friends turned against him, their eyes vacant and voices monotone as they delivered clearly rehearsed testimonies. "I would never harm your people," Philip shouted, straining against his bonds. "This is madness!" But the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. Ren's voice rang out, cold and final. "Exile to the Dreadclaw territories." Philip found himself unceremoniously dumped at the edge of the wilderness, his supplies confiscated. As night fell, familiar growls surrounded him. Dreadclaws emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. To Philip's amazement, they didn't attack. Instead, the lead Dreadclaw approached and gently nuzzled his hand. Philip felt a strange tickle in his mind, almost like a greeting. Over the following weeks, Philip immersed himself in Dreadclaw society. He learned their vocalizations, their hunting techniques, their social structures. But most incredibly, he discovered their ability to communicate through a form of rudimentary telepathy. One night, as Philip sat by a fire with his new pack, a flood of images suddenly filled his mind. He saw Malon and Dreadclaws living side by side, working together, sharing resources. Then came flashes of conflict, betrayal, and a bitter separation. "You were allies once," Philip muttered in awe. "What happened?" Meanwhile, back in the Malon settlements, Ren's propaganda machine churned relentlessly. "The human threat has been neutralized," he announced to cheering crowds. "I will protect you from any who would harm our way of life." But not everyone bought into the lies. In the village Philip had saved, a small group gathered in secret. "I saw how he calmed those beasts," an elder Malon whispered. "That was no act of aggression." "Ren's story doesn't add up," another agreed. "We need to find out what really happened." This pocket of resistance began to grow, carefully gathering information and searching for a way to clear Philip's name. As Philip delved deeper into Dreadclaw culture, he realized the key to everything lay in uncovering the truth about the ancient conflict between the two species. With his unique position as a bridge between worlds, he knew he had to find a way to bring peace to Zorath and expose Ren's deception. Philip gazed out at the alien landscape, the Dreadclaws lounging nearby. He had a long, dangerous road ahead, but he was determined to see it through. Somewhere out there, answers awaited, and allies he had yet to meet. Philip huddled close to the Dreadclaw pack as night fell on Zorath. The alien wilderness teemed with unfamiliar sounds and scents. He shivered, acutely aware of his vulnerability. Days turned to weeks. Philip observed the Dreadclaws, mimicking their vocalizations and body language. Slowly, he began to pick up flashes of their thoughts, fragmented images and emotions. One night, as Philip shared a freshly killed prey animal with the pack, he felt a tickle in his mind. The lead Dreadclaw, a battle-scarred female he'd dubbed Scar, locked eyes with him. A flood of images poured into Philip's consciousness. He saw Dreadclaws and Malon working side by side, building structures, hunting together. Then came flashes of violence, Malon turning on their allies, slaughtering Dreadclaw young. The images grew chaotic, explosions, fleeing Dreadclaws, a devastating war. Philip gasped, reeling from the onslaught of information. "You were friends once," he whispered. "What happened?" Over time, Philip pieced together the tragic history. Centuries ago, Malone and Dreadclaws lived in harmony, but a faction of Malone extremists saw the predators as abominations. They plotted in secret, then struck without warning. The Dreadclaws tried to negotiate, but were met with brutality. Philip watched through shared memories as Dreadclaw envoys were butchered, their peaceful overtures answered with plasma fire and orbital bombardments. As Philip integrated further into Dreadclaw society, hunting and sleeping among them, he couldn't shake the parallels to his own situation. Ren's paranoia, the fabricated charges, it was history repeating itself. One day, Philip caught sight of movement at the edge of Dreadclaw territory. He crept closer, Scar at his side. To his shock, he recognized faces from the Malon village he'd saved. They were clearly searching for something, or someone. Philip emerged from hiding, hands raised. The Malon nearly fled in terror before recognizing him. "We know the truth," one whispered urgently. "Ren lied. We've been gathering evidence, but we need your help." Philip turned to Scar, conveying the situation through their nascent mental link. The Dreadclaw's initial hostility faded as she grasped the implications. That night, Philip brought the resistance members before the Dreadclaw elders. As Scar projected the true history into the Malon's minds, gasps of shock and sorrow filled the air. "We had no idea," one resistance fighter sobbed. "All this time." Philip knew this was their chance. "We can end this cycle," he said, "but we'll need to work together." Over the following weeks, Philip coordinated between the Dreadclaws and the growing Malon resistance. They shared intelligence, planned joint operations. The Dreadclaw's speed and ferocity paired perfectly with Milan technology and tactics. Meanwhile, Ren grew increasingly unhinged. His propaganda grew more outlandish, his crackdowns more brutal. But with each raid, each piece of evidence uncovered, his support dwindled. Finally, Philip stood at the head of a combined force of Dreadclaws and Malin rebels. Before them loomed Ren's fortified command center. "This ends today," Philip said, locking eyes with Scar. The Dreadclaw's mental voice resonated in his mind. Together. With a roar that shook the earth, they charged. The ground quaked beneath their feet as Philip and his allies stood before the awakened Titan. Its massive wings unfurled, scraping against the cavern walls and sending showers of ice crystals cascading down. The creature's eyes, each larger than a Malon transport ship, blinked open, focusing on the tiny figures before it. Philip stepped forward, his heart pounding. He raised his hands, mimicking the gestures he'd used to communicate with the Dreadclaws. The winged Leviathan tilted its head, studying him with ancient intelligence. "We need your help," Philip said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. He projected images of the pterosaur's destruction, entire settlements vanishing into the earth. The creature's nostrils flared, and a low rumble shook the cavern. It lowered its massive head, bringing one enormous eye level with Philip. He felt a presence brush against his mind, alien and vast. Suddenly, Philip stumbled back, overwhelmed by a flood of memories. He saw Zorath as it was eons ago, teeming with life. The winged predators soared through ancient skies, keeping the pterosaur population in check. Then came flashes of a great hunt, Milan ancestors wielding strange weapons, driving the flying titans to extinction. "They didn't know," Philip gasped, looking up at the last of its kind. "We're here to make it right." The creature's eye narrowed, considering. Then, with a sound like thunder, it spread its wings and launched itself upward, smashing through the icy ceiling. Philip and his team raced to the surface, emerging just in time to see the Leviathan soar into Zorath's sky. Its wingspan blotted out the sun as it circled once, twice, then headed towards the nearest pterosaur-infested region. They followed in their fastest vehicles, struggling to keep pace. As they crested a hill, they saw a pterosaur burst from the ground, its maw lined with razor-sharp teeth. Before it could fully emerge, the winged titan struck. The battle was swift and brutal. The Leviathan's talons tore into the pterosaur's armored hide, ripping it from the earth. With a bone-crushing bite, it snapped the burrower's spine. Philip watched in awe as the flying predator systematically hunted down pterosaur after pterosaur. It seemed to have an innate sense of where they would surface, always striking at the perfect moment. As night fell, Philip's team made camp. The distant sounds of combat echoed across the plains. Scar, the Dreadclaw leader, approached Philip. "You've saved us all," she projected into his mind. Philip shook his head. "We're not done yet. We need to find a way to coexist with both species. The balance must be restored." He gazed up at the sky, watching the silhouette of their newfound allies soar past. The real work was just beginning. Philip knew he'd have to use every ounce of his diplomatic skills to forge a future where Malin, Dreadclaw, pterosaur, and the winged Leviathan could all find their place on Zorath. As dawn broke, Philip steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The planet's ecosystem hung in a precarious balance, and he was the linchpin holding it all together. Philip stood at the edge of the cliff, his eyes fixed on the colossal winged predator. Its scales glinted in the harsh Zorath sunlight as it circled overhead. He took a deep breath, focusing his thoughts. "Easy now," he murmured, projecting an image of calm waters. "We're not here to hurt you." The Titan's massive head swung towards him, its eyes, each larger than Philip's entire body, locked onto his small form. A low rumble shook the air. Philip felt a pressure building in his skull. Alien thoughts, primal and chaotic, battered against his consciousness. He gritted his teeth, struggling to maintain the connection. Suddenly, the Titan's wings snapped open. The downdraft knocked Philip off his feet. He scrambled backward as the beast's talons gouged furrows in the rock where he'd been standing. "Philip!" Scar's mental voice cut through the chaos. The Dreadclaw leader bounded to his side, hackles raised. The Titan roared, a sound that shattered the stillness of the alien landscape. With each beat of its wings, it rose higher into the sky. "We need to follow it," Philip gasped, climbing to his feet, "before it reaches the settlements." They raced to their waiting vehicles. Malin warriors and Dreadclaw trackers piled in, weapons at the ready. Philip grabbed the controls of the lead skimmer, pushing it to its limits as they pursued the airborne Leviathan. The Titan's massive form cast a shadow over the terrain as it flew. Philip watched in horror as it approached a Malin outpost. Panicked shouts and the whine of defensive weaponry filled the air. "No!" Philip cried out. He closed his eyes, concentrating with all his might. He projected images of the pterosaurs, of the destruction they wrought. "They're the real enemy," he thought fiercely, "not the Malin." The Titan wheeled in the air, momentarily confused. It veered away from the settlement, its primordial mind struggling to process the information. Philip turned to his assembled team. "We need to guide it away from populated areas," he said. "Lure it somewhere we can contain it safely." Scar nodded, her mental voice grim. "The canyons to the north. We can trap it there." They split into teams, Dreadclaws racing ahead to serve as swift, elusive targets. Malin engineers deployed plasma cannons, not to harm the Titan, but to direct its path with precisely aimed bursts. Philip coordinated the efforts from his skimmer, guiding the Titan through a series of hair-raising aerial maneuvers. The canyons loomed ahead, a maze of towering rock formations. As they entered the narrow passageways, Philip felt sweat beading on his forehead. The Titan's wings scraped against the canyon walls, sending showers of debris raining down. "Now!" he shouted. Explosives detonated, triggering a cascade of boulders. The Titan screeched as its path was cut off. It landed heavily, talons scrabbling for purchase on the rocky ground. Malin artillery units opened fire, their plasma bolts sizzling through the air. The Titan roared in fury and pain as the energy bursts singed its scales. Philip leapt from his skimmer, heart pounding. He approached the trapped behemoth, hands raised. Its massive head swung towards him, jaws agape. He reached out with his mind, tapping into the psychic link he'd forged with the Dreadclaws. Ancient memories flooded his consciousness. Malin and Dreadclaws working together, living in harmony. The winged Titans soaring overhead, respected guardians of the skies. Philip projected these images with all his strength. The Titan's eyes widened. It cocked its head, a low rumble emanating from deep in its chest. Slowly, cautiously, Philip felt the Titan's mind brush against his own. Curiosity replaced rage. Recognition flickered in its ancient consciousness. Images of pterosaurs flashed between them. The Titan's memories stirred, eons-old hunts, the thrill of the chase. It understood the threat these subterranean monsters posed. Philip stepped closer, his hand outstretched. The Titan lowered its massive head until Philip's palm rested against its scales. "Together," Philip said aloud, the word echoing in both their minds. The Titan's agreement rumbled through the canyon. It spread its wings, no longer trapped, but allied. Philip turned to his assembled forces, a fierce grin on his face. "Let's go hunting," he said. They moved out, a united front of Malin, Dreadclaw, and primordial power. The winged Titan took to the skies once more, this time as their vanguard. In the distance, the ground trembled. A pterosaur burrow erupted, spewing dirt and rock. The Titan's keen eyes locked onto the target. It folded its wings, diving with breathtaking speed. The impact shook the earth. Malin and Dreadclaw forces surged forward, weapons blazing. The pterosaur, caught off guard by the aerial assault, found itself surrounded. Philip watched from his skimmer as the battle unfolded. The Titan's primal fury, tempered by the precision of the Malin Dreadclaw forces, tore through the pterosaur's defenses. As the dust settled, Philip allowed himself a moment of hope. They had a chance now, a real chance to save Zorath. Philip wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the aftermath of their latest strike against a pterosaur den. The massive winged titan circled overhead, its shadow sweeping across the scarred landscape. Nearby, Malan's soldiers and Dreadclaw warriors tended to injuries and secured the perimeter. "We pushed them back," Scar projected into Philip's mind, her mental voice tinged with fatigue. "But for how long?" Philip nodded grimly. "This isn't sustainable. We need a long-term solution." That night, as the Allied forces rested in their makeshift camp, Philip pored over ancient Dreadclaw scrolls. The flickering light of a plasma lamp cast eerie shadows across the weathered parchment. His eyes widened as he deciphered a crucial passage. "The great beasts of the earth, sky, and below lived in harmony," he read aloud, each playing its part in the dance of life and death. Scar tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "What does it mean?" Philip's mind raced. "It's all connected. The pterosaurs, the winged titans, the extinct herbivores, and us. We've thrown everything out of balance." He called an emergency meeting, laying out his theory to the assembled Malan and Dreadclaw leaders. "We need to restore the ecosystem," Philip explained, pointing to a holographic map of Zorath. "Reintroduce the species we drove to extinction." Ren, the Malan commander, scoffed. "You want to bring back more giant beasts? We can barely handle the ones we have." "It's our only chance," Philip insisted. "The pterosaurs are running rampant because we eliminated their natural food sources and predators." Despite objections, Philip's plan gained traction. Days later, he found himself leading an expedition into uncharted territory. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they ventured deeper into Zorath's wilderness. Philip's heart raced as he caught sight of movement in a distant valley. He raised his binoculars, breath catching in his throat. A small herd of massive, elephant-like creatures with elongated trunks and thick, leathery hides lumbered across the plain. "Trunkbacks," he whispered in awe. "They still exist." With painstaking care, Philip and his team constructed massive energy field corrals. They worked tirelessly, herding the gentle giants into the enclosures. Each successful capture brought them one step closer to their goal. Weeks turned into months as they scoured the planet for more species. They located a group of spike-mouths, their bodies covered in bony plates and razor-sharp spines. The capturing process proved even more challenging, with several close calls as the creature's natural defenses put Philip's team to the test. Back at the newly established reservations, Philip watched with pride as the captured herbivores began to thrive. He stood on an observation platform, marveling at the sight of trunkbacks and spike-mouths grazing peacefully on the lush vegetation. His satisfaction was short-lived. A tremor shook the ground, followed by an ear-splitting roar. A pterosaur burst from the earth, its massive jaws snapping shut around a young trunkback. Before anyone could react, it disappeared back into its tunnel, leaving only a cloud of dust and the anguished cries of the herd. Philip smacked his head against the railing. "They're adapting faster than we anticipated. We need the winged titans here now." The capture and transport of the colossal flying predators pushed the Alliance to its limits. Philip coordinated from the ground as Malan ships used tractor beams and energy nets to corral the titans. The beasts fought viciously, nearly breaking free multiple times during the arduous journey. Finally, as dawn broke over the reservation, Philip gave the signal. The energy barriers containing the winged titans powered down. The massive creatures took to the sky with ear-splitting shrieks, circling the enclosure. Chaos erupted below. Trunkbacks trumpeted in terror, stampeding across the plain. Spike mouths huddled together, their spines dripping. Philip watched, heart in his throat, as the titans dove toward the panicked herds. "Now, Scar!" he shouted. The Dreadclaw leader bounded forward, projecting calming thoughts towards both predator and prey. Other Dreadclaws joined in, forming a psychic web that slowly soothed the frightened animals. Hours passed as the delicate balance began to take shape. The winged titans, recognizing the pterosaurs as fellow predators, established hunting territories. The herbivores, guided by the Dreadclaws, learned to coexist with their new guardians. As night fell, Philip watched a pterosaur surface near the edge of the reservation. It hesitated, sensing the presence of the airborne apex predators. With a frustrated growl, it retreated underground, moving away from the protected herds. Philip allowed himself a small smile. It was working, but he knew their greatest challenge still lay ahead, ensuring this fragile peace would last. The fragile peace Philip had established hung by a thread. He knew that without a unified approach, Zorath would descend back into chaos. Standing before the assembled Malin leadership, he took a deep breath and spoke. "We've made progress, but it's not enough. We need a planetary council, Malon, Dreadclaws, and Winged Titans working together to govern our shared world." The room erupted in angry shouts. Ren, the Malon commander, strode forward, his face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" he spat. "You're an outsider, Philip. You have no right to dictate Malon affairs." Philip stood his ground as Ren jabbed a finger at his chest. "This isn't about rights," he said firmly. "It's about survival. We're all in this together." But Ren was already rallying his supporters. "Brothers and sisters, don't let this alien sympathizer strip away our sovereignty. The Milan have ruled Zorath for generations. We won't surrender to beasts and mind readers." Philip watched as the crowd divided, with many nodding in agreement with Ren. He knew he needed to act fast. "I'm going to the Titan nesting grounds," he told Scar later that night. "If I can convince the Skyrain Alphas to join us, it might sway them along." The Dreadclaw's mental voice was tinged with concern. "It's too dangerous, Philip. The volcanic wastes are treacherous, and the Alphas are unpredictable." But Philip was already packing supplies. "We don't have a choice." The journey was brutal. Philip trudged across a hellscape of jagged obsidian and bubbling lava pools. The acrid air burned his lungs, and more than once, he nearly lost his footing on the unstable terrain. After days of grueling travel, he finally reached the Titan's ancestral nesting grounds. The Skyrain Alphas towered above him, their massive wings creating gusts that threatened to knock him off his feet. Philip raised his hands, projecting calm. He began the intricate series of movements and vocalizations that formed the ancient Dreadclaw greeting ritual. The Titans watched, their ancient eyes unblinking. For hours, Philip communicated with the Alphas through a combination of gestures, mental projections, and carefully chosen words. He showed them images of the pterosaurs, of the delicate balance they'd achieved, and of the threats that still loomed. "Your power is needed," he said, his voice hoarse from the sulfurous air. "Join our council. Help us protect Zorath, your home." The ground shook as the male alpha lowered its massive head, bringing one enormous eye level with Philip. He felt the pressure of its ancient mind pressing against his consciousness. After what seemed like an eternity, the alpha straightened. It let out a piercing cry that echoed across the wasteland. Philip sagged with relief, understanding their agreement. The council chamber fell silent as the Skyrain Alphas landed outside. Their massive forms cast shadows through the windows, causing many Malin to shrink back in fear. Ren seized the moment. "See how they threaten us," he shouted. "This is what Philip's unity looks like. Cowering before monsters." Philip stepped forward. "No one's cowering," he said calmly. "The Alphas are here as equals, to help build a better future for all of us." The debate raged for hours. Ren and his supporters hurled accusations, questioning the right of inferior species to have a say in planetary governance. Philip countered each argument, emphasizing the interconnectedness of all Zorath's inhabitants. Just as it seemed the two sides had reached an impasse, one of the Skyrain Alphas let out a low, resonant hum. The sound reverberated through the chamber, and Philip felt a strange pressure building in his mind. Suddenly, he was no longer in the council chamber. He soared through pristine skies, looking down on a Zorath untouched by Malin colonization. He felt the joy of the hunt, the bonds of family. Then came flashes of terror, Malin weapons, falling comrades, dwindling food supplies. The ache of near extinction burned through him. Philip gasped as the vision faded. Looking around, He saw the same shocked expressions on the faces of every being in the room. The Skyrain Alphas had shared their ancestral memories, laying bare the tragic history that bound them all. Ren staggered, his face ashen. I had no idea, he whispered. Seizing the moment, Philip outlined his vision for the Zorathian Council. Equal representation, he said. Shared stewardship of our resources. Diplomatic resolution of conflicts. It's the only way forward. The debate that followed was intense but measured. As the hours wore on, Philip saw the shift in the room. Even some of Ren's staunchest supporters were nodding along with his proposals. Finally, as the twin suns of Zorath began to set, a vote was called. Philip held his breath as the tally was counted. When the final result was announced, a narrow but clear majority in favor, he let out a ragged cheer. The Zorathian Council was born. As Philip watched Malon, Dreadclaw, and Titan representatives sign the charter, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a perfect solution, and he knew challenges lay ahead. Ren and his remaining loyalists glowered from the sidelines, a reminder that not everyone embraced this new era. But for the first time since he'd crash-landed on this turbulent world, Philip felt a flicker of hope as he watched the Zorathian Council charter signing, but that hope was short-lived. Within days, reports flooded in of coordinated attacks on Dreadclaw nesting grounds and winged Titan territories. The council chamber erupted in chaos as holographic displays flickered to life, showing burning settlements and fleeing civilians. Philip's stomach clenched as he watched a Dreadclaw hatchery engulfed in flames, the piercing cries of trapped young cutting through the static. "This is an outrage," thundered Castor, the Dreadclaw representative. "We demand immediate action." Philip stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "We condemn these attacks in the strongest possible terms. The perpetrators will face justice." But as the days wore on, enforcing the council's will proved easier said than done. Philip pored over intelligence reports, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. The attackers melted away into remote Milan settlements, exploiting centuries-old grievances to find safe haven. "They're using our own people against us," growled Liran, a moderate Malon council member. "Every raid turns more to their cause." Philip nodded grimly. "We need to cut off the head of the snake. Ren's behind this, I'm sure of it." The plan came together quickly. Philip stood before a mixed strike team of Dreadclaw trackers and winged Titan riders, outlining their mission. "We find Ren, we bring him in, alive." The hunt stretched across Zorath's most unforgiving terrain. Philip's lungs burned as they scaled razor-sharp cliffs, the acrid smell of sulfur pools stinging his nostrils. More than once they narrowly avoided ambushes, Dreadclaw precognition warning them of danger. Finally, after weeks of grueling pursuit, they cornered Ren in a fortress carved into the side of an active volcano. Philip peered through his binoculars, assessing the defenses. Energy barriers shimmered around the perimeter, and heavily armed Malon patrolled the walls. "Surrender, Ren!" Philip's amplified voice echoed across the barren landscape. "You can't win this." Ren's laughter crackled through their comm units. "I've already won, Philip. Every moment you waste here, my followers grow stronger. You'll never take this stronghold without destroying everything you claim to protect." Philip lowered the communicator, his mind racing. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath, and even if they succeeded, it would only martyr Ren and his cause. There had to be another way. He closed his eyes, remembering the first time he'd connected with the Dreadclaws, the raw power of their shared consciousness. An idea began to form. "I need to get inside," Philip said, turning to his team, "under a flag of truce." The plan was met with protests, but Philip was adamant. Hours later, he stood at the fortress gates, hands raised. "I've come to negotiate," he shouted. The massive doors creaked open, and Philip found himself face to face with Ren. The Malon commander's eyes gleamed with triumph. "So the great unifier comes crawling," Ren sneered. "Here to beg for peace?" Philip kept his expression neutral, even as he reached out with his mind, feeling for the faint psychic threads connecting him to the dreadclaws outside. "Something like that," he said. As Ren launched into a tirade about Malon's superiority, Philip concentrated, weaving those threads into a rudimentary bridge. He could feel the dreadclaws' surprise, then their understanding. Ren's words faltered as the first wave of psychic energy washed over him. His eyes widened in confusion, then fear. What is this?" he gasped. Philip pushed harder, channeling not just his own memories, but the collective history of Zorath. Ren staggered, bombarded by visions of ancient cooperation between species, of the devastation wrought by conflict, of the fragile beauty they all shared. Around them, Ren's followers clutched their heads, overwhelmed by the telepathic assault. Weapons clattered to the ground as hardened warriors wept, overcome by the weight of their shared past. Ren fell to his knees, his face a mask of anguish. I didn't know," he whispered. "What have I done?" Philip placed a hand on Ren's shoulder, his voice gentle. "It's not too late to make this right." The journey back to the council citadel was subdued. Ren and his followers offered no resistance, their spirits broken by the revelation of their shared heritage. As they approached the towering spires of the capital, Philip saw crowds gathering, their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. The trial that followed was broadcast across every settlement on Zorath. Philip watched as Ren, his voice barely above a whisper, confessed to his crimes and begged forgiveness from those he had wronged. In the months that followed, the work of reconciliation began. Former enemies worked side by side to rebuild damaged habitats and establish new lines of communication. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but slowly, a new sense of unity began to take hold. Philip stood on a balcony overlooking the sprawling city, a mix of Malon, Dreadclaw, and Titan architecture blending seamlessly. He allowed himself a small smile, feeling for the first time that true peace might be possible. But even as he basked in this moment of triumph, a chill ran down his spine. In the deepest canyons and darkest caves of Zorath, something ancient and malevolent stirred, awakened by the shifting balance of power, a threat that would soon test their newfound alliance to its very limits. The chill that ran down Philip's spine proved prophetic. In the months that followed, reports trickled in from the farthest reaches of Zorath. Scout teams vanished without a trace. Seismic sensors registered inexplicable tremors deep beneath the planet's crust. Explorers returned from remote caverns with tales of bizarre biological residues coating the walls. Philip pored over the data, a growing sense of unease gnawing at his gut. He called an emergency council meeting, his voice tight as he addressed the gathered representatives. "We're facing something we don't understand," he said, projecting holograms of the disturbing findings. "These anomalies are escalating. We need answers." The council authorized a joint Malon Dreadclaw expedition to investigate the subterranean disturbances. Philip watched the feed anxiously as the team descended into a vast network of unexplored caverns. For hours, there was nothing but routine chatter. Then, abruptly, screams erupted over the comm channel. Philip leaned forward, his fist clenched as he gripped the console. "What's happening down there?" he demanded. Static crackled, punctuated by inhuman shrieks and the sound of tearing flesh. Then silence. Days later, Philip stood at the mouth of that same cave system, flanked by a contingent of Skyrain Titans. The stench of decay wafted from the darkness, and something viscous dripped from the cavern walls. "We go in together," Philip said, activating his helmet's night vision. "Stay alert. Whatever's down there, it's unlike anything we've faced before." They descended into the abyss, the Titans' massive forms barely squeezing through the narrower passages. The deeper they went, the more alien their surroundings became. Pulsating tendrils of organic matter snaked across the floor. Strange, membranous sacs hung from the ceiling, quivering with unseen movement. Philip's breath caught in his throat as they entered a vast chamber. Before them sprawled a nightmarish landscape of interconnected hive structures, each pulsing with an eerie bioluminescence. And at the center, a mass of writhing tentacles and eyes that seemed to stare directly into Philip's soul. "By the ancestors," whispered one of the Malon soldiers. "What is this place?" Philip opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a terrifying screech filled the air. From every crevice and tunnel, a horde of mutated creatures surged towards them. Philip glimpsed familiar features twisted into monstrous new forms, the remnants of the missing expedition, now warped beyond recognition. "Fall back!" Philip shouted, firing his plasma rifle into the oncoming swarm. The blasts tore through the first wave, but where one creature fell, two more took its place, the bodies of the fallen rapidly absorbed and reshaped by the pulsating ground beneath. The titans roared, unleashing gouts of flame that scorched the cavern walls, but even their immense power seemed futile against the endless tide of parasitic horrors. As they retreated, Philip's mind raced. Conventional weapons were useless against this threat. They needed a new strategy, and fast. Back on the surface, Philip called an emergency war council. Representatives from every species gathered, their faces grim as they viewed the footage from the reconnaissance mission. "We're calling it the xenofauna," Philip explained, his voice hoarse. "A hive mind capable of assimilating and repurposing organic matter. It's already spread through most of the southern cave systems." Panic rippled through the assembly. Philip raised his hands for silence. "I have a plan," he said, locking eyes with the assembled Dreadclaw telepaths. "But it's going to take everything we've got." Philip outlined his risky move, a coordinated psychic assault on the xenofauna's neural network. The Dreadclaws exchanged uneasy glances, aware of the immense strain such an attack would place on their minds. "It's our only shot," Philip pressed. "We have to try." Hours later, Philip stood at the command center, surrounded by the most powerful Dreadclaw telepaths on Zorath. Outside, the Skyrain Titans formed a protective perimeter, ready to defend against any physical assault. "On my mark," Philip said, his hand hovering over the activation switch. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Now!" The air crackled with psychic energy as the Dreadclaws unleashed their combined mental might. Philip felt the pressure building in his skull, threatening to split it open. On the monitors, seismic activity spiked as the xenofauna reeled under the assault. For a moment, hope flared in Philip's chest. The hive mind's control wavered, its relentless advance halting. But then, with horrifying speed, it began to adapt. New neural pathways formed, bypassing the damaged sections. The seismic readings went off the charts as the xenofauna launched a furious counterattack. "It's not working," Philip shouted over the cacophony of alarms. "We have to—" His words were cut off as the ground beneath them heaved. Through the viewports, Philip watched in horror as twisted, biomechanical monstrosities erupted from the earth, their forms a nightmarish fusion of assimilated life. The Titans roared, engaging the onslaught, but even their immense strength began to falter against the endless waves of mutating horrors. Philip's voice cracked as he gave the order he'd hoped to never utter. "All forces, fall back to the secondary defensive line. We're abandoning the southern continent." As they retreated, Philip watched entire cities vanish beneath a tide of writhing flesh and snapping mandibles. The xenofauna's advance seemed unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. In the war room of the Malon capital, Philip stared at the holographic map of Zorath, vast swathes of it now pulsing an angry red. He turned to face the grim assembly of council members and military leaders. "We're out of options," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to propose. "We need to initiate Protocol Omega." A collective gasp filled the room. Protocol Omega, the scorched earth contingency they'd all prayed they'd never have to use. Philip's fingers flew over the holographic controls, marking vast regions for orbital bombardment. Each swipe of his hand condemned millions of acres to fiery oblivion, but it was the only way to buy them the time they desperately needed. "May the ancestors forgive us," he whispered, and pressed the final authorization key. From orbit, massive energy weapons powered up, their targeting arrays locking onto the doomed territories of Zoreth. Philip watched through tear-blurred eyes as the first salvo lanced down from the heavens, turning the xenofauna-infested lands into a sea of plasma and radiation. The agonizing screech of the hive mind reverberated through the planet, felt by every living being. But as the smoke cleared and the readings stabilized, a grim reality set in. It wasn't enough. Already, new growth was stirring in the irradiated wastelands. The xenofauna impossibly was adapting even to this. Philip turned to his assembled allies, his face ashen. "We make our stand here," he said, gesturing to the Malin capital. "One last push to end this, or we fall trying." As they prepared their final defenses, Philip couldn't shake the feeling that they were only delaying the inevitable. The xenofauna's tendrils were already probing at the city's outskirts, testing for weaknesses. He looked out over the sprawling metropolis, knowing that in mere hours it would become a battleground unlike any Zorath had ever seen. The fate of their world hung in the balance, and Philip steeled himself for the fight of his life.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.